African slavery involved the ultimate commodification of labour. It exemplified the apotheosis of both the law of property and the right of government to decide the identity and conditions of all who lived under it. Capitalism. You've probably already heard of such a term before, maybe from a family member, or from a friend, or from academia if you go to university like me. But for most people, it is best well known in its political context within political circles. However, with these kinds of discussions, there's a lot of mystery surrounding its conceptualization. What is capitalism? Why is it such a dominant force of economics? What has truly been its impact? What people tend to not know about is the historical context of these discussions. With this video essay, I hope that you may be able to acquire the knowledge to more effectively articulate in these discussions answers to these questions, or at least open your mind to looking further into it. What will be explored in this video are a few key areas to help understand this. These will be definitions, economic functions and foundations that slavery helped establish, specific case studies, and finally, alternative perspectives within scholarly debates. So, let's get to it. Before we go further into this video essay, I think it is important to establish the groundwork for the definitions that we are going to be focusing our topics around. What I mean by this are 4 definitions in particular, being slavery, colonialism, empire, and most importantly of all, capitalism. The reason for the last one being so important is something we'll touch on soon, of course, but generally it's necessary to understand how we are framing these terms, especially when it comes to understanding how it relates to its connections with capitalism. First in the line is slavery. The word slavery is most commonly associated to have come from the term Slav for the Slavic people. For example, Marek Jankowiak discusses how the Sakaliba was a term that in medieval Arabic literature denoted the Slavic populations of Central and Eastern Europe, and possibly some of their neighbours. Now, there are some sources out there that dispute the origin for this word, but for the purpose of this video, it will not delve too much into that topic, as for the sake of this, it's just giving a bit of background to it. But delving further into what the characteristics of slavery are, one can understand this by comparing African slavery with European slavery. Interestingly, both societies possessed the institution, and both tended to define slaves in the same way, as subordinate family members, in some ways equivalent to permanent children. Remarkable documentation allows glimpses of the underlying ideology. The term for a slave, nuclei, was the same as for a child, suggesting the family idiom prevailed there. It showcases that the common theme here is that there is a need for subordination to apply to slavery, but any old subordination will not do, of course. Importantly, subordination worked in tandem with them acting as a form of proprietary labour. In Europe, that was definitely private property more so, but interestingly, there is a difference with African slavery in that it had both a private and public element to it. John Kelly Thornton elaborates further from the previous quotation in saying that African slaves were typically used in 2 different ways. First of all, slaves became the preeminent form of private investment and a manifestation of private wealth, a secure form of reproducing wealth equivalent to landowning in Europe. But secondly, slaves were used by state officials as a dependent and loyal group, both for the production of revenue and performing administrative and military service in the struggle between kings or executives who wished to centralize their states. But regardless of that difference, there are, of course, the legal definitions for it or the general dictionary definitions for it. According to the 1926 Slavery Convention, it fixed the definition of the term slavery as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. Cambridge Dictionary discusses that it is the activity of legally owning other people who are forced to work for or obey you. Oxford Dictionary discusses that it is the state or condition of having the legal status of being the property of another person, of having no personal freedom or rights, and of being used as forced labor or an unpaid servant, the fact of being enslaved in voluntary servitude. So, with understanding that there is a commonality in these definitions, with these ideas being subordination, ownership, property, legality, and labor. With this, we can roughly set out how we may define slavery, with it being the condition of being legally owned by someone else as a form of property and permanent cheap labor, forced to obey and to work for their owner's will, with limited to non-existent political rights, often being reinforced with the usage of law, violence, and or intimidation. This will help to make it so that this applies to both European and African slavery. And also to note, violence and subordination is especially important here to say, because I believe it is that in these definitions, in these more commonly cited areas, they tend to forget about it. Now comes the next definition, that being colonialism. It's something you may most commonly imagine with the Victorians and the scramble for Africa, a point in time that some historians denote as the height of colonialism. Likewise, your conception of it probably did match with how early modern Europeans understood it. Gabriel Paquet discusses how, to early modern European ears, the words colonization and colonies both derive from the Latin word colere, which can be translated to as to cultivate, or to put to use, or to make of value. In antiquity, this word was used to describe the migration and resettlement of some portion of the population of a given polity to another territory. The implication of that being that the resulting settlement maintained connections, cultural, economic, political, with the sending community. Interestingly, in the Spanish Empire, the newly settled and colonized lands were conceived of as overseas kingdoms within the Hispanic monarchy, with similar rights to that of their mainland counterparts. It is something that is interesting to note of when we get to the definition of empire. With the dictionary definitions, colonialism, according to Cambridge Dictionary, is the belief in and support for the system of one country controlling another. Likewise, with Merriam-Webster, colonialism is the domination of a people or area by a foreign state or nation, the practice of extending and maintaining a nation's political and economic control over another people or area. Now, collecting all of this together, the definition that this video essay will be using is: colonialism is the imposition of a system of control of one country or entity ruling over foreign land for the purpose of expanding economic, political, and social power of the ruling group, coming in the form of replacing a portion or in whole of population of their land in any of those three areas. It's important to place emphasis on the matter of replacement of a people's power and land, as I believe something like the dictionary definitions may confuse people with inflating imperialism and colonialism as the same thing. The focus here is colonialism, of course, but I do want to just point out that these two terms mean different things, even if they do definitely work hand in hand together. The next definition that we're going to be mentioning, which is also very much linked to colonialism like imperialism is what an empire is. An empire was effectively the vehicle in which colonization and imperialism could be engaged with in the first place. It allowed for the acquiring of the necessary tools to gain a necessary outreach as to allow for large-scale exploitation. Historian Stephen Howe explains how his understanding of what an empire is, with it being a large, composite, multi-ethnic or multinational political unit, usually created by conquest and divided by a dominant center and subordinate, sometimes far distant peripheries. Noting with relation to something being a multinational political unit, of course, the early modern people of that time wouldn't have known what that was or even thought in that way in the first place, since nationalism at that point in time wasn't really much of a thing, at least in the way in which we understand it now. So whilst acknowledging that, it's to understand that these definitions that I'm explaining and how these historians do it is through a modern perspective. There are a few key words there to consider further, such as large and distant or so on. There's a thing to note about this at this point in time, which is that even with the creation of vast colonial empires in places like the Americas, it wasn't all just one centralized unit that controlled everything. Such a thing was not feasible at the time due to the limitations of technology and knowledge in relation to communication and administration. Because of this, there was something called what I describe as the partition of sovereignty. One example of this would be the Dutch East India Company. Historian Adam Clulo argued that the company was actually a collection of rights rather than a monolithic or indivisible whole that could be split up and parceled out to more than one party. Thus, in early modern empires, the possession of a sovereign right was commonplace. Sovereignty was often divided within a single political community, and legal pluralism simultaneously operating, and sometimes overlapping systems of law was the norm. But nevertheless, at the very top, there were still main figures that ran things. Think of it as like a captain steering his ship. Sure, he's the captain and he has a lot of power in his own right, but he cannot control this large and mighty vessel on his own. And so he delegates or decentralizes power to a certain extent to certain individuals to make things run more effectively. It was through this system in which vast wealth was to be made. Powerful states led by royal executive figures, kings, sultans, shahs or emperors, determined policy, provided patronage, unleashed military force and enforced legal codes which enabled merchants, migrants and missionaries to seek their fortunes in foreign lands. Of course, we'll also make reference to the dictionary definitions with this as well, with Merriam-Webster describing an empire as a major political unit having a territory of great extent or a number of territories or peoples under a single sovereign authority. Cambridge Dictionary describes empire as a group of countries ruled by a single person, government, or country. So, composing these elements together, the definition that will be constructed for empire in this video essay, especially of the colonial kind, is that it is a system of control in which one dominant area, center, subordinates various foreign pieces of land composed of various multi-ethnic and multinational political units through the division of parts of its sovereignty to maintain control over those areas. It's also useful to point out that you do not need an empire to have an emperor or an empress in order for it to be constituted as that. The best example of this would be the British Empire, in which the monarchs who ruled over it never actually acquired some kind of empire-level title for most of its existence until at least Queen Victoria, when she was crowned as Empress of India. Now, as I've already mentioned at the start of this video, we get to one of the trickiest ones out of all the definitions, that being capitalism. This is probably going to be the longest part out of all these definitions. So, there are historians out there who believe capitalism does not have a definition, or that what we currently use for capitalism tends to be misguided in what we view as its aspects. For example, historian Richard Crosby argues from an anti-Marxist approach that capitalism takes on currency only because it is defined in opposition to socialism. Crosby argues that the term industrialization is more precise in capitalism because the former can be defined in terms of output and productivity, while capitalism cannot be defined at all. You can see how he understands the discourse around capitalism as being defined around and by socialism. But I take issue with what he says, and how historians might try to argue this as well. Capitalism, like any kind of word, can be defined, even if it may be difficult to do so. I particularly disagree with trying to substitute industrialization for capitalism, as the former denotes a specific change in what the means of production are, whilst the latter denotes who owns the means of production, what do we do with those means of production, and as well the relationship to the means of exchange. In fact, there are measures of wealth, or what is known as the scale of wealth, which we can use to help us define capitalism. I won't go too much into depth about this, as there's probably YouTube videos out there or people out there who can explain it far better than I can, but it is worth noting nonetheless. I want to also show you how its history of development and emergence actually stretches back quite far. For example, in all three continents, we find relatively, not absolutely, small agricultural regions, generally hinterlands of proto-capitalist cities, which were being penetrated by capitalism in the period just prior to 1492. Among these were Flanders, southern England, northern Italy, the Nile Valley, Malabar, Coromandel, Bengal, northern Java, and south coastal China. Historians John Sender and Shelia Smith, arguing from a Marxist approach, states that capitalism is a form of organization of production in which the direct producers sell their labor power, since alternative means of survival are increasingly constrained. Petty producers have been separated or have very little control over their means of subsistence, with the most important implication that the production process is substantially different from production processes characterizing other societies, being there are systemic pressures leading to accumulation, the accumulation of capital. This is showing capitalism to be creating something new out of destroying the old, capitalism understanding it within its early modern context. Something I'd like to also point out is the conversations we have within our modern discourses about globalization. What people don't know or don't realize about this is that it isn't something that has just come about as of recently. It's only that the scale of it recently has become more profound than ever. In fact, global interconnectedness is something that has been a feature of our world for a while now. You can understand this as a feature of capitalism, as a factor that shaped regional histories, as a process that progressively added value to the capital, labor, and goods, or destroyed values that they commanded in earlier centuries. By understanding this, we can see how it forwarded Europe into this interconnected system, particularly with the acquisition of new lands in the Americas. This is shown with how, when the occupation of the Atlantic islands gave European proto-capitalists a substantial amount of empty land with nearby cheap slave labor, they found that they could undersell for traditional Mediterranean producers and so make fine profits. This was one of the key discoveries in the history of capitalism, fully as important as the steam engine. During the 16th century, these producers simply displaced the traditional producers. The overall supply of sugar did not increase until later, and so created the first truly important proto-capitalist industry. There was an interesting word used just there, proto-capitalism. When you hear of that, you may think of it as something before capitalism. Not exactly capitalism, but leading up to it maybe. However, I don't want you to get confused by this, so for the sake of clarity, and at least explaining how I will be using it and how I understand it, I'll address proto-capitalism as capitalism in its infancy, not yet the fully dominant economic system we know of now, but beginning to emerge as the main generator of wealth for states, battling against the system of feudalism leading into the preceding centuries of the rise of colonialism. You can think of it as pre-industrial or pre-modern financial capitalism. And of course, we can also mention the dictionary definitions, with Merriam-Webster describing capitalism as an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. Cambridge Dictionary describes capitalism as an economic and political system in which property, business, and industry are controlled by private owners rather than by the state, with the purpose of making a profit. With that being said and done now, the definition in this video, collecting everything we've said so far, will be that capitalism is an economic mode of production and of exchange centered around four key tenets, that being 1. The private ownership of said means of production and of exchange. 2. Selling of labor power to be used and transformed into wage labor. 3. Usage of that form of labor to create commodities to distribute and sell in the market. And 4. The accumulation of capital being the end goal of all of this. So you can see how this is distinct from feudalism, as feudalism prioritized holdings of land as the main method of generating wealth in relation to the hierarchy that we all probably know of with the distinctive triangle. Now compare that to capitalism, where the commodity form is prioritized in production and exchange. To note with capitalism as well, in relation to the modern discourse we have, there is this idea that capitalism is inherently in contradiction to the role of the state involving itself in the activities of capitalism, especially if you were to ascribe to more hardcore libertarian viewpoints. Yet, history shows this is and was not the case. In fact, the state was one of the main ways capitalism could develop in the first place. For example, one well-established and forceful partnership throughout history was the alliance between the political state and the economic elite. The closest associations between state power and commercial enterprise developed in the European, Russian, and Ottoman empires. According to mercantilist theory, the state should play a central role in directing foreign trade. With the empire definition mentioned earlier in the video, we mentioned the concept of patronage as well. You can understand this by how, in the case of the Northern Europeans after 1600, the state's role was vested in the hands of parastatal chartered companies, such as the Dutch West India Company, the English Royal Africa Company, or the French Senegal Company, which made their own arrangements with private traders. Often, the two types of trade, which we might call crudely private versus state-sponsored, coexisted or alternated uneasily as rulers sought to find a formula that maximized revenues and minimized efforts and costs. Note here further with mercantilist theory and what it talks about with reference to the role of the state. You wouldn't call the modern-day social democratic countries of the world not capitalist because the state was used in some capacity, would you? So it is not contradictory to say that mercantilism and what was happening at the time was not capitalism in some form. It's just that it was merely a different way of capitalism being engaged in. As already pointed out repeatedly, it was being engaged in its infancy. So we've now set out the necessary definitions. As we continue through this video, it will become more apparent with further information, cementing these conceptualizations. Particularly of capitalism in its emerging existence during this point in history, you'll see how just apparent it was, how incredibly wealthy it made the countries of the West. We now arrive to the part of the video that begins to get deep into the discussion between the relationship of capitalism and slavery. The particular element of exploitation in this economic model allowed not only for great wealth in general, but for that wealth to over time accumulate, and there being the necessary resources and investments, as well as the necessary innovative developments that led Europe to become a powerhouse of the world, particularly with some kind of contribution to the Industrial Revolution. First, we need to get a sense of the scale of just truly how large the slave trade was. According to reliable estimates, they show that between 1500 and 1870, 9.5 million Africans were deported to America as slaves. The consequences of this demographic drain are as yet unstudied, but it is common opinion that it may have had relevant depressing effects on the population of West Africa. Furthermore, there's also where these slaves mostly went to once they were shipped, with, across the early modern period, approximately 40% of enslaved Africans being transported to Brazil, 40% to the Caribbean, 50% to Spanish America, and 5% to British North America. But it wasn't only African slavery that existed. Whilst the enslavement of Africans and their descendants was the most prevalent form, the extent of Amerindian slavery was notable and indispensable to European designs, especially in the early phases of colonization. The discussions around demographics and differing perspectives outside of just purely economics will be important, and I'll go into more depth about this later on in the video. When it came to the early phases of expansion and conquest, there was a particular way in which these colonizers did it. This would be plunder and asset stripping. It was especially vital as, of course, the plantations and industries that we would mostly assume with our modern understanding of this period in time had not yet been created or developed. Plunder or asset stripping is the most common original motive for expansion, and until the 17th century, it was the dominant one. The settlement of Spanish America flourished only where commodities might easily be extracted and retreated, as in Hispaniola and Cuba, where these resources dwindled. But even once industries and economic activity began to emerge, plunder did not go away. It only became integrated in the form of the economic activity itself, as forced or otherwise coerced labor was particularly prevalent where the economy was organized around extractive and export-oriented industries, like mining and plantation-based agriculture. With this, there is something very interesting that someone who studies this can pick out, which is how notice that most of this normal capital accumulation, surplus value from wage labor, not to mention forced labor, was involved in all of this, and most of it was value from production, not simply from trade. The last part about accumulation and surplus value is especially important, especially with the differences between production and trade, which you will understand why a bit later. But there are a variety of things that you can pull out from this activity that resembles so much about capitalism, especially with how sugar production emerged to become such a profitable industry. The sugar plantations of Barbados, and later Jamaica and Saint Domingue, were in fact at the cutting edge of capitalist civilization. Whether we look at the size of the labor force attached to single enterprises, its task specialization, its subordination to a time discipline, its alienation from its tools, its wholly expatriate character, the capital and machine-intensive nature of sugar production, its extensive economies of scale, and its dependence on long-distance trade for inputs and for exporting its product. When noting the relationship between capitalism and slavery, it is necessary to also point out how there's a lot of discussion over the amount of direct profit in which these traders acquired. One estimate, for example, says that the average 10% rate obtained in studies of the 18th century French and English slave traders was considered a good profit rate of a time, but not out of the range of other contemporary investments. A very high percentage of all sales in America were for credit, and though a markup on the price occurred, the long repayment period and the resulting discounting of notes and failed installment payments reduced profits or drew out the completion of a sale for 2 to 3 years. It's noting these words in particular that is very important, like credit and installment payments. Although the trade itself may have had limitations in terms of how much one could make a profit directly, this tended to be circumvented with the fact that these uses of credit and so on could allow for the taking out of large loans. They could make even greater profits in more risky ways. Cycles of slavery were intimately connected to the first cycles of credit and indebtedness. Modern institutional loan sharks are inheritors of much earlier forms of predatory proto-capitalism from the past. Repayment was to be made in the product of the mills, and indeed over several centuries, the perpetually indebted and failing New World planters, buying overpriced imports from Europe, more than repaid their debts in the form of sugar, molasses and rum, and in a downstream supply and demand based on these commodities. With having established an understanding of the ways in which this way of using labour and garnering of profit was done, there's also an understanding of how slavery was engaged in, not only with the Europeans, but also with how the rulers and economic elite of Africa engaged in it. There were particularly deeply embedded foundations of slavery in Africa too, as the reason that slavery was widespread in Africa was not, as some have asserted, because Africa was an economically underdeveloped region in which forced labour had not yet been replaced by free labour. Instead, slavery was rooted in deep-seated legal and institutional structures of African societies. It's very good to note this, since enslavement derived from European labour demands, but the entire process of the continent, from capture to disembarkation, remained largely under the control of Africans. But alongside this, there also needs to be an acknowledgement that this new way of how Europeans introduced themselves into these markets affected the way in which it was conducted greatly, even to a point where it began to spiral out of control for the Africans. In Congo, enslavement gradually became feared by even the highest status families. In most parts of Africa, war captives, criminals, and indebtors had often become dependents of a powerful family. Even though there was rarely at this early stage the idea of cashing in these relations of debt or power by selling a person to an Atlantic trader, yet these horrors had grown rapidly as traders sought to take advantage of an economic and political whirlwind that no one really knew how to control. This was so much so that in the 1680s, it had been estimated that gold and to a lesser extent ivory and other products made up over 50% of the value of exports from Africa. By the 1780s, these non-slave items had fallen to only an estimated 8% of the total value of goods exported from this region. Now, there may be one source in particular that you've noticed I'm using. This source is from the book The Rise of Merchant Empires, particularly Chapter 9, titled The Economic Aspects of the 18th Century Atlantic Slave Trade by Herbert S. Klein. There's an argument that he makes in this book which does in fact go against the main argument of this video, which other historians may also make and point out, which is that though clearly the slave trade was in all respects a profitable and important trade, it evidently was not the single largest capital-generating trade of the Europeans, even within the context of their American empires. Even if the part of the Asian trade that went to Africa is added into these calculations, along with the value from slave-produced American goods, the figures are still not a significant addition to potential European savings available for investment in the Industrial Revolution, nor do they match the figures for the most economically profitable of Europe's overseas trades. If these estimations hold up under critical review, they will bring a significant challenge to the important element in the Eric Williams thesis on the importance of the slave trade and American slavery in providing the capital savings for the Industrial Revolution in England. I want to say that there's some problems in the way in which this is being argued, and that I believe it is downplaying the contributions this wealth made to the development of Europe and the Industrial Revolution. First, let's take some data on the wealth that was generated and what it contributed to, which may bring into question this argument. Whilst this may not be fully definitive, as Klein does rightly point out in his work, we can nonetheless get some kind of scale. For example, by 1690, Dalby Thomas could write that the sugar has contributed more to England's pleasure, glory and grandeur than any other commodity we deal in or produce, wool not excepted. Davenant, a few years later, estimated that the plantation trade accounted to £720,000 of England's 2 million external commerce, and much of their estimate for European trade amounted to re-exports. Around slaving in the plantation trade emerged shipbuilding, insurance, banking, and a great deal of textile and the metal manufacture. Furthermore, this from produce was incredibly valuable, since produce from plantations amounted to around 40% of the trade of the leading European Atlantic states. The annual value of colonial exports, the great majority of which came from plantations just before the American Revolution, was £5.6 million for British America, $5.2 million for French America, and $1.8 million for Brazil. Individual colonies and individuals within colonies were very rich. So, even in the colonies themselves, in which so-called plantation societies formed around, there were those who acknowledged just how incredible it was for them. The increasing value of slave property, accounting for over 40% of non-landed wealth in Jamaica in the 1770s, made investing in slavery an economically logical decision. Planters' investments in this property made them among the wealthiest businessmen in the world. Total wealth in the British Caribbean in 1774 has been estimated at £51,926,327, with only 16.3% of the total population of British America and 2.4% of the white population. The Caribbean had 32.2% of its wealth, a characteristic of inequality you may note about capitalism here. This number in particular about wealth in the British Caribbean would be worth more than £10 billion in today's money if converted and adjusted for inflation, according to the Office for National Statistics Composite Price Index. This price index, mind you, has been tracking as far back as 1750. So clearly in raw numbers, it seems to have contributed quite a bit. But as already mentioned earlier in this video, it isn't just for the direct numbers that historians should be looking at. There needs to be an understanding of the then eventual production of goods that this trade would allow for and create, but particularly also how this production necessitated innovations in order to be able to expand profit margins and remove restrictions. Historians abstracted the slave trade from the Atlantic economy as a whole and attempted to measure the profits accruing to those who literally handled or employed enslaved peoples. They then claimed that his slavery made only a minimal contribute to total domestic investment. This conclusion ignored slave trade and plantation profits that arose from speculation, credit extension, risk capital, and other forms of financial intermediation. Even though Klein has acknowledged that there being a role of credit, there's so much more with this and with other speculative and risky practices that I believe he does not acknowledge. even if some leeway can be given to understanding how trying to get down a scale of contribution is very much difficult. Slave trade profits and accumulated wealth by planters and merchants reinvested back in the metropolis no doubt provided a stimulus to growth, although it is true that few plantation profits went directly into industrial development. But recent work in world history suggests that American land and products gave Western Europe a vital extra edge through ghost acres. Britain in particular was able to pioneer the transition to industrialization while having available to it the output of acres of highly fertile land in the New World. Having these ghost acres obviated the British needing to devote resources to gain what it gained from overseas produce. Moreover, industrialization benefited not just from export markets, but also from technological innovations in finance and insurance that resulted from long experience with the difficulties of long-distance trade in slave and slave-produced goods. It's all good and well to see that these people made a large profit, and there were exchanges between both European and African rulers and traders which facilitated this. But there's another perspective which is also very intriguing. Did this come to benefit the impoverished and lower classes? We'll use England as a good case study due to its significance. Going as far back as the early modern period, there's a good paper titled Homicide in Early Modern England, 1549 to 1800, The Need for a Quantitative Synthesis, by Professor Randolph Roth. Despite its title, it also has solid data relating to other metrics too. As you can see here, there was a sharp decline in real wages, which, according to various estimates, fell as much as between a fifth and a third from the 1570s and the 1630s. Likewise, this mirrored a decline in birth rates, which dropped by a third from the 1570s to the 1660s and did not recover until the 18th century. This did have a drastic consequence on life expectancy as birth as well, as life expectancy for newborn children fell by 8 years between the 1570s and 1670s, with poverty and poor nutrition taking their toll. Furthermore, Irfan Habib, whilst replying to the Brenner thesis, would remark how Brenner tells us, even so, grain prices ceased to rise. This allowed real wages to increase, a new golden age for the working people. What Brenner says here is contradicted by studies of the movement of real wages in England that we have access to. One such study, that of wages in building traders over the period 1250 to 1950, shows real wages taking a deep dip around 1600, then recovering slowly to reach the 1550 levels only by 1750. Thereafter, the real wages declined with a deep dip around 1800. This further backs the point that was made in that case study by Randolph Roth. One may point out that the English Civil War was occurring during the mid-17th century, and so would have had to be factored in. Of course, with war, there most likely was some kind of negative effect on the ability to have stability in engaging in the economy. For example, with how this period for cotton traders was known as the dark decades of the 1640s to the 1660s. It also probably would have contributed to even greater fleeing of migrants from England, which had already begun to occur in larger numbers during Charles's reign. Roughly 20,000 to 25,000 Puritans departed for the New World in the 1630s. Population growth was stymied, however, by horrifically high mortality rates. Of the 8,000 men, women and children brought to Virginia, a mere 1,218 were still alive a few years later. This would have exacerbated economic issues, particularly around labour shortages in the mainland. But what this does show is a mechanism specifically part of colonization, which we talked about earlier with the definitions, with how there are populations from the mainland to replace the original native populations, helping to establish these plantation societies permanently and to facilitate expansion further into new territories to increase wealth. Regardless, however, there is evidence to suggest that, in fact, despite the evidence, which would have disproportionately affected the poorest and lower classes more so, there were great strides taken for significant structural changes to the economy. Let us first focus on the half-century from 1650 to 1700. What happened in these decades? The answer is that a significant structural transformation in the economy coincided with a period of slight population decline to produce a huge surge in income per capita. The structural transformation was threefold. First, in manufacturing, there was a leap in the export production of textiles driven by the new draperies, a blend of wool and other fibres that was lighter than the old draperies of heavy wool. Second, there was the importation of Dutch agricultural techniques into England, leading to shifts in crop rotations and use of fodder crops that allowed light soil regions to greatly increase their productivity for wheat, allowing heavy soil regions to specialise more in livestock raising. And finally, religious shifts in this period were favourable to Britain. Despite the turmoil of the Puritan Revolution, Restoration, and Glorious Revolution, Britain in the late 17th century remained a region open to Protestants. Britain thus attracted Protestant refugees from the continent, especially from France, who brought capital and skills with them, providing a positive shock for production and trade. Following the Glorious Revolution and the emergence of the new monarchy out of the Commonwealth period, these changes coinciding with state authority from the Crown benefited heavily those at the very top, as, in England, the Crown's policies inadvertently, and in fact contrary to royal intentions, consolidated the power of a single unified elite, the gentry, with strong rights and interests in private property, creating widespread political and ideological networks through which they could exercise control. The gentry inadvertently created a highly productive agricultural sector that provided the underpinnings of the English Industrial Revolution by accumulating capital, proletarianizing the labour force, and increasing agricultural production. Ultimately, there seems to have been limited benefit for the least well-off in society during this period. It was a time of great upheaval, which, while granting new economic opportunities, saw the vast destruction of much of the old life of those at the bottom. Peasant agriculture lasted in England as late as the latter half of the 18th century, when it was overthrown by the great movement of enclosures undertaken by the landlords with the full aid and support of Parliament. The entire violent process of the destruction of the English peasantry, which is perhaps the single most consequential revolution in English agrarian history. Even in some cases, it also brought back the old in a new augmented form to suit these new economic capitalist conditions. New World slaves were not the only tortured collaborators of urban Europe. As Ferdinand Braudel reminded us, simultaneous with the rise of the trading cities of Western Europe and the slave plantations of the Atlantic, came the second serfdom, east of the line which stretched from Hamburg to Venice. Peasants who were already emancipated when Columbus reached Guanahani found themselves resubordinated. For the final part of this section of the video, I'd like to address something called the Great Divergence debate, coined by Kenneth Pomeranz. It's a very important debate which can give a sense of the effect of the scale of wealth that Europe accumulated over time, to see when Europe began to truly get an advantage over the rest of the world. You'd be surprised how much disagreement there is over this. I've already mentioned and touched on briefly in this video about early proto-capitalist cities elsewhere in the world besides Europe. The wealth that Europe managed to gain would have given them advantage over the traditional economic powers of the world, residing mostly within China and India, through price and trade manipulation. The supply of bullion was essentially continuous, so that the prices which European proto-capitalists could offer for commodities, labour and land were persistently higher than those of their competitors, so that the European proto-capitalist community steadily undermined the competition in all markets across the hemisphere, within Europe and without. It is interesting to note this in comparison with how, prior to the 16th century, Europe had absolutely no advantage over Africa and Asia as to the level and rate of development out of feudalism and towards capitalism, a process that was going on in many regions of the Eastern Hemisphere. The fact that Europeans reached the Western Hemisphere before Africans or Asians did so is a reflection only of location, accessibility, not a level of development. But the question surrounding when exactly Europe began to diverge from Asia and gain a true advantage through these emerging exploitative practices and institutions of European capitalism. From what we can tell, Pomeranz suggested that this was probably still true in 1800 and almost certainly around 1750. The 1750 claim remains plausible, though disputed, the former less so. A recent paper by Stephen Broadberry, Han-Hui Guan, and David Da-Kui Lee suggests a divergence in per capita GDP at a date closer to 1700 than 1750. For some, particularly from a classical point of view, they feel they have now firmly dated the origins of the Great Divergence, and that their data strongly supports the classical view that it began in the centuries before 1800. They argue that the data shows early and sustained growth in GDP per capita in Northwest Europe, starting from the late Middle Ages. This is a return to the views of scholars such as Ferdinand Braudel, Immanuel Wollaston, and Carlo Cipolla, who saw a commercial revolution starting in the 13th and 14th centuries in Europe, with great fairs and growing cities, and trade then expanding through the age of exploration and colonial empires from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Yet from what we can tell of data, this might be a bit of a stretch. This does underestimate just how far advanced these other parts of the world were at this time, even by the 15th century, and furthermore may not factor in something like the Black Death, which would have most definitely stunted the potential growth in the 13th and 14th centuries, even reversing it. This shows with how the proto-capitalist port cities of Europe were not more highly developed than those of Africa and Asia in the 15th century. In fact, urbanization in Europe was probably less advanced than urbanization in China, India, the Arab region, and no doubt many other non-European areas. The urban population in early Ming China was perhaps 10% of the population. In the Vijayanagar Empire of southern India, it must have been at least as high. Comparable centres in Europe, such as Paris, may have had half that percentage. And even then, well into the 1800s, despite that point, China and India suffering from decline due to the colonialism of the West. Robert Allen's reconstruction suggests that as late as 1820, productivity per labour day in Yangtze Delta farming was 90% of England's, and that annual net income for a Delta tenant family was slightly higher than for a similar English household. Another study puts labour productivity in Yangtze Delta farming circa 1800 as equivalent to that of Holland, which was 94% of English levels. Military and technological capabilities going into the 1800s was also nothing to scoff at, especially if one were to reference the gunpowder empires. The military encounters between Europeans and Asians were evenly matched till the early 19th century, which indicates that technological capability was comparable and that technological development in places like India was not stagnant. Having acknowledged that, generally speaking, from what we can tell, a likely possible answer is that the Great Divergence could have still in fact started early, with Stephen Broadberry pointing out how China, according to GDP per capita estimates, peaked at around 1500, and of course, with what was discovered by that point, Europe beginning to go ahead afterwards. Broadberry even points out further micro-level perspectives, with them being called little divergences. But GDP per capita is something to take with a pinch of salt, and isn't and shouldn't be the only defining metric. More likely than not, the effects of colonization took time to see the results of Europe truly gaining a solid advantage. New analysis of the data of Broadberry and co-authors makes it clear why even expert observers of the British economy in the 18th century, such as Adam Smith, could not see signs of any economic divergence. There was simply no evidence of any departure from pre-modern growth patterns before 1750. Explanations for the Great Divergence that claim to find its roots in late medieval or early modern growth patterns are thus mistaken. To understand the onset of distinctly modern economic growth, with sustained increases in both population and real income at high rates, leading to levels of income not seen in prior eras, we need to develop explanations for relatively late and sudden transformation to a new mode of economic growth that appeared only after 1750. So overall, this video does acknowledge that it could potentially be placed somewhere in the 18th century, but it goes to show how even the great wealth amassed by the old powers of Asia is still nothing to scoff at. Due to the complexity of the discussion at hand, it is no wonder that there is no definitive agreement at hand, and further research would probably help in clarifying already made discoveries. With what's been said so far, you've probably noticed that there's been a heavy focus with England. They were one of the biggest empires in history, of course, and there have been passing mentions of other contributors to this development of slavery and capital. But I really want to hone in on some key information through particular case studies. This is that the dual relationship resulted in the home countries being affected through ways in which the wealth generated was used. It was a continent-wide contribution and transformation that allowed for their own interest to become the world's interest because of it. We'll look at Iberia first, home to the countries that entered into this practice of colonization the earliest compared to their neighbours. The first effect that this had on the Iberian nations was the political ramification, in that access to American bullion buttressed if not underpinned the rise of royal absolutism, or at least pretensions to it, in the Iberian Peninsula. The state now derived significant revenue from the colonial economy. Such inflows of precious metals and receipts from royal monopolies decreased the fiscal burdens felt by elites in Europe, while lessening the crown's dependence on them. This shift may have made the elites more pliable and less resistant to increasingly bold royal incursions into previously unmolested spheres of social, economic and political life. But of course, when talking about something like this, there isn't just the political changes, but especially the social changes and domestic development that it allowed for. Although we've touched on the questionable nature of what benefits it brought to the lower classes, it nonetheless caused considerable demographic and urban sprawling. Whether caused by these attempts or merely coterminous with them, there was remarkable urban, mercantile and demographic growth in the Spanish Empire, particularly after 1770. This surge was sparked by export-led production of tropical commodities, galvanized by the dramatic influx of African slaves. The loosening of trade regulations clearly played a role, too, particularly the 1778 Commercio Libre, Free Trade Decree. There was rising demand for and consumption of European finished goods, cotton, linen, silk, but also agricultural goods such as oil, by Spanish Americans. There's an ironic case to touch on with Portugal as well when it came to just how reliant these countries became on the resource-intensive extraction of their colonial peripheries. This, of course, would be Brazil. It had grown so wealthy and large in many aspects that the dynamism of Brazil's economy prompted high-placed officials to propose a transfer of the seat of the monarchy. As early as the 1730s, they recognized that Brazil's wealth and its demographic weight within the monarchy had surpassed that of Portugal. Portugal slowly becoming extraneous to Brazil's economy, which was premised on the African slave trade and galvanized by slave labor. You could see just how much this would have most likely affected the Portuguese upon Brazil acquiring independence from their overlords. Brazilian independence deprived Portugal of its largest and most lucrative economy. In 1820, the population of the Portuguese Empire was 7.3 million. In 1850, it stood at a mere 1.65 million. Another very important European power that engaged in this trade was the Dutch Republic. The Dutch were very highly successful when it came to the trade and the production of commodities. One can see this without the Dutch West India Company. From 1629 to 1654, the Dutch West India Company controlled large parts of the sugar-producing areas in Brazil and disrupted trade and production in the areas not under their control. In the same years, the VOC import of sugar was also considerable, 1.95 million PD or guilders a year from 1637 to 1642, bringing the total of Dutch annual sugar imports around 1640 close to 5 million kilograms. The story of the Dutch Republic, particularly within the 17th and 18th centuries, was that of incredible ingenuity, having made the most significant contributions to the advances of economic practices, to the point where other European powers began trying to copy it into their own practices because of how effective they were. With considerably smaller territory and comparatively minuscule population, the Dutch managed to wage war across the globe and compete with their own gargantuan rivals. Dutch survival was mostly attributable to the ingenious use of public debt. The payment of interest and redemption of loans were guaranteed by the government. A further inducement to lend was the high rate of return offered to those who purchased government-issued bonds. They supplied more than 1,000 slaves to Spanish America between 1658 and 1729. Dutch commerce retained certain advantages over its rivals. These included its robust merchant marine, low freight charges, capacity to transport bulky goods cheaply, and the attractively low interest rates Dutch merchants extended to their suppliers. And with the final case study of the European powers comes France. France, before even colonization began, was rising to quickly become one of the foremost leading powers of Europe due to its high population and the era of the lingua franca, making French the common language in many of the courts of Europe. But even during the heights of early colonization, France had become the greatest re-exporter of colonial goods in Europe. France was ultimately the victor of the sugar wars in Martinique and Guadeloupe during the 1650s and in Santo Domingo around 1700. An Americanization of French commerce then revealed itself. In the mid-18th century, colonial commodities alone represented more than half the French sales to the United Provinces, which is the Netherlands. Their value reached 12.4 million livres, approximately 3 times that of traditional goods, wines and brandies. This method of re-exporting and gearing of the economy around this replaced a lot of the old dominant production that France had, as Asian markets began to take precedent over domestic production. The role of East Indian products is well revealed in the French trade with Africa in 1775 and 1788, which had a constant and dominant role for Indian cloths, representing 54 and 57% respectively of the total value, 10.5 million livres in 1775 and 14.7 million in 1788 of goods used to purchase slaves. With the addition of small quantity of European cloths, the total value of all textiles represented 59 and 64% respectively of all goods shipped. But of course, France also played a significant role in the practice of slavery during this time. Interestingly, for them they would have mostly done this with the Native Americans, as whilst they did engage in the African slave trade, and the Caribbean was one of the largest producers of wealth for them, the largest colony resided in mainland North America, being in Canada, and where most of their migrating populations went to. In North America, the French plugged themselves into pre-colonial systems of enslavement and enforced labor. Algonquian and Sioux peoples enslaved their enemies as a form of symbolic domination, and then traded slaves to the French to cement their alliance. Some of these enslaved Amerindians remained in North America, but many were shipped to the French Caribbean as laborers in the burgeoning plantation system. So, just to recap, we've discussed how Europeans organized labor and capital during colonization. A sense of the scale of that in numbers, understanding the perspectives of the lower classes, the perspectives of the countries that benefited from this labor and capital, and questioning when this eventually led them to the forefront of world power. I want to now lead you to other effects and ramifications that this period of colonization created, most notably to do with demographics and ecology. The former is something that may be likely to be considered anyways, but the latter less so. The two are very much tied to one another and to everything said so far. Let's first have a look at demographics. In Africa, due to the increasing number of slaves that were needed to meet European demands, it began to cause a male drain in parts of West Africa, as men were the ones who were typically chosen as slaves due to their physique being suitable for the labour-intensive industries. From what we can tell, simulation models predict that the sex-skewed loss of population would alter sex ratios in West Africa to about 80 men per 100 women in the adult age brackets. In fact, a study of the Angolan census of 1776 does point to a male-to-female ratio of 43 to 100, meaning that there were more than 2 adult women for every man in the region at the time. Of course, it wasn't just Africa as well, but in the Americas and just in general parts of the world that had been untouched by Europeans. The world's greatest demographic disaster was initiated by Columbus and Cook and the other marinheros, and Europe's overseas colonies in the first stage of their modern development, charnel houses. The temperate zone colonies developed less distinctively. They became neo-European, with only minorities of non-whites. This notion of the neo-Europes would have been especially prominent in the place in which the most land became available to Europeans through the sheer scale of death that was brought about through disease or forced labour or whatever. The numbers given by Denovan, Newson and others range from 54 to 110 million individuals lived in the Americas in 1492. 5 decades later, only 3% of 5% remained. Although regional variations were marked, with regions where the collapse was total and others where it was moderate, the overall picture is devastating. In the Caribbean, the population disappeared within 1 generation. In coastal central Mexico, the decline was a factor of 26. In Peru, populations fell from 9 million people to 600,000 within 80 years. Because of these demographic changes, the consequences of these were so large it had worldwide implications, most notably for the North Atlantic region and their climate. It's seen with how the large abandonment of expanses of agricultural fields in the Americas due to the massive demographic collapse brought about by European colonization and the subsequent reclaiming of those areas by forest expansion leaves its footprints in the atmospheric CO2 levels of the 17th century. The demographic collapse of the native population of the Americas can be offered as an additional factor that forced the North Atlantic region into the climate pattern known as the Little Ice Age. This relationship between a historic event and the climate suggests that human behavior had a significant effect on climate centuries before the known consequences of industrialization on weather patterns. Understanding this, it is incredible to see, and in fact can eerily be drawn to similar conclusions with what is currently happening with the climate now, and how modern industries contribute to its changing climate. This need to expand and exploit in order to accumulate wealth had consequences of so many millions. This loss of potential Native American slave labour is a primary reason why African slave labour began to be used instead. The influx of new people and companies with their specific needs that Native Americans did not meet. The destructive sugar economy not only required heavy manpower, it also consumed a vast number of trees needed for carbon for the sugar processing. Lumber was also needed for the homes of settlers, for storage facilities, furniture, plus ship repair. The demand resulted in rapid deforestation of Hispaniola and many other islands. By 1650, the ecological landscape of the islands would have been almost unrecognizable for the original Taino. Now, these are just sort of general ecological consequences that may or may not have been in the awareness of the Europeans at the time, or at least they wouldn't have minded it much. But it didn't mean that these people at the time were completely oblivious to the role of ecology. In fact, another part in what led to the extraction of capital to be so successful was how the study of botany, astronomy, mineralogy, and so forth was not a dispassionate pursuit. Instead, as Drayton contended, it was at the foundation of a faith that empire might be an instrument of cosmopolitan progress and could benefit the imperialized as well as the imperializers. They often erased the contributions of indigenous collaborators who supplied the natural knowledge underpinning scientific advances. This final piece in the puzzle, known as the Columbian Exchange, led the way for advancements in the sciences. The stealing of this knowledge and what these crops could do for the Europeans became crucial. Just as the wholesale production of livestock animals emerged out of the early modern biological exchanges, the commercial cultivation of plant crops on plantations also belonged to the global movement of organisms. As part of an emergent ecological regime, large-scale farming enterprises represented the convergence of several biological and economic elements that had lasting effects throughout the world. Europeans discovered unique American crops, such as tobacco and cocoa, that once cultivated were transformed by strong demand into commodities on a world market. Even the colonists themselves began to take note of how things began to change once knowledge and skills became developed enough. The premier British botanist of the Victorian age, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who witnessed the advance of European weeds in Australia and New Zealand circa 1840, opined that many of the small local genera of Australia, New Zealand and South Africa will ultimately disappear, owing to the usurping tendencies of the immigrant plants of the Northern Hemisphere, energetically supported as they are by the artificial aids that the northern races of man could afford them. Over the course of this video, a lot of information and discussions of topics has been relayed. What I hope this video essay has done is showcase its importance within the framing of various perspectives and in the importance of what this means for our modern world. How through these perspectives, you can come to understand that whilst there is an incredible number of differences in this period compared to now, there are so many similarities in the things that we carry into the now. Capitalism, in fact, continues to mirror many of the practices that we have seen, even if it has developed over time, and many of the consequences renewed in new ways. So many of the worst off continue to languish from its adverse effects. It was built off of these early practices and will only continue to do so. We will still most likely have to grapple with the consequences of what has been, what is now, and what will come, whether it be global inequalities, the power structures in place, the cultural identities that have been created, and so much more.